Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much. And thank you for that introduction. And let me thank Purash Kanpur College for inviting me. And it's quite an honor to be a part of this series of lectures called Cerebrations, which is a lovely name, as I thought. And today, when we first talked, I asked you what should I talk about, and you said theatre of the absurd, and I quite readily agreed because this is something that I have been thinking about for a while. Because Harold Pinter being my research interest for a very long time, too long, I guess. But the theatre of the absurd, and I kind of became more interested in this particular lecture because it seemed that the situation that we are in now, which makes this webinars and these online virtual lectures necessary, is by nature quite absurd, because the absurdity that we define in life in theatre is essentially when our primary idea of narrative gets violated, and the kind of narrative sense that we are used to becomes all topsy-turvy, and we have to get into a new kind of routine, a new kind of life. That is when the absurd comes into play. That is where we kind of become aware of the absurdity of life and all that. So this entire idea of narrative discontinuity, narrative deflection, this is something that we have been having in history quite regularly. It occurs at regular intervals, and in fact we have this tendency of historicizing everything. And in fact, when this pandemic started, people started saying that every 100 years we have something. In 1920 we had something, in 1820 we had something. So we desperately tried to make sense of the events that happen to our lives, and whenever we cannot make sense of it, it is we call it absurd. Now, the theatre of the absurd, we know why and how the theatre of the absurd came around. I'm not going to get into that in any detail as such, because I don't want this to become a huge, long, boring kind of a thing. And I see a lot of my friends are here, my colleagues and friends. So I don't really want to bore them this morning with a lot of stuff that are easily available everywhere. So what I thought is I would not give you a structured kind of a presentation, not a presentation, it's structured kind of a discussion, because that's what we are talking against. This is when we are talking about the theatre of the absurd, we are talking about a non-structural, non-structured kind of a thing. But having said that, I have made some notes which I will consult from time to time, because otherwise people who know me know that I tend to speak a lot of rubbish and I tend to go off script. So even though I am going to talk about the theatre of the absurd and how anti-structured that is, I have created a structure, some notes, and I will be referring to them. Now, let me just put this entire thing into context. And yes, one more thing that I need to mention here is that I am going to talk about England. I am not going to talk about continental theatre as such, because the absurd in England is not like the tradition of the absurd elsewhere. And if one can at all trace a tradition of the absurd as such, because there is no lasting tradition, there is no continuity when we are talking about the theatre of the absurd. So, but still, let me put this into context, because we see at the beginning of the 20th century, this idea of realism and naturalism is being established. The ideas of naturalism and realism are being established, and these ideas, they have their own set of resistances. It's not like they become unanimously accepted everywhere, or they rule, or they replace all present traditions. It's not like that. They become a part of the theatrical experience. And there were several severe reactions against naturalism in the continent elsewhere. American theatre has a very different kind of progression. But when we look at England, we see that realism, naturalism are being accepted quite openly, and the other forms that one may think of, they are not being accepted as well openly as or as happily as the traditional modes of representation, because England is one country where we do not see a lot of surrealism. I mean, there are some instances, but there isn't the tradition of surrealism, the tradition of anti-realism. These things are not being established at the beginning of the 20th, when modernism, high modernism is starting. These things are not coming into play. I mean, one or a few experiments, like not entirely 20th century perhaps, but even when Oscar Wilde is writing Salome, it's not being accepted as wholeheartedly as one may have thought it would have been. But the resistance against the other is something that England has always practiced. England, this has been there. Anyway, that's a different discussion altogether. What they have always preferred are going back to the classics. I mean, reinventions perhaps, or authentic representations of Shakespeare. This is the general idea that they have been practicing. And when we come to the second half of the 20th century, post Second World War, we know all that. There is a huge change. But how much of a change? Because it's not like, this is something that I intend to talk about, that it's not like the theatre of the absurd is coming and it's becoming the dominant genre. It's not like that. The dominant ideas on stage remain the traditional authentic ideas. We have a lot of other options which come into play, and they remain options. They do not become the dominant generic presence. So in the second half of the 20th century, surprisingly, because perhaps of the USSR paradigm, there is a general resistance towards left-wing politics. The Labour Party is very much there. There are some people who are talking about this, even socialism and communism. But the predominant public mood is not quite in favor of that. In England, in the continent, it's a little different. The political atmosphere is a little different. But in England, it's not entirely that much leftish as such. Yes, we have someone like Bond writing, we have someone like Arden writing, and they are talking about their sympathies, but as you know, Edward Bond is not being allowed for a long time, until 1968, I think, until the censorship laws, the Lord Chamberlain's laws, where theatre was censored. Until then, not a lot of Bond you can see. Even after that, Bond is never really becoming popular. Bond is never really becoming a major voice in the West End tradition, or not even close to it. Bond is still writing, so and he still remains that iconoclastic anti-establishment figure. And of course, Wesker is talking about social evils, as we say, and the social system is being attacked, but nothing like what we have in the United States of America, because there we have this very serious, radical, in fact, kind of theater which is beginning, particularly Leroy Jones or somebody like James Baldwin, the black theater, the African American theater kind of a thing. A different kind of resistance is beginning, is something that we see there. Even the musical, Sondheim is looking at the musical, reinventing the musical. A political statement is being included in the otherwise happy musical scenario, which in England also is happening. So what we have is a time when we have a variety of theatre, and the theatre of the absurd becomes one element in that variety. Just because I am going to talk about the theatre of the absurd doesn't mean that I am going to tell you that it was the king of drama or something like that at that time. It was a phenomenon, it was a significant phenomenon, but that is why I am focusing on England. It was not the primary kind of a thing that you had on the English stage. Of course, in the US, Albee is writing. Albee is becoming one of the most significant playwrights. Here, not here, in England, we have Harold Pinter, we have Beckett, of course, some of Beckett's English plays. We have Harold Pinter, whom I do not think to be a part of this theatre of the absurd thing. I will be talking about Pinter after a few moments. We have Tom Stoppard, who is practicing in this theatre of the absurd tradition. Again, I don't know whether I should use the word tradition, but the form, let's say. But somehow, if you think about it, if you think in terms of popularity, if you think in terms of is theatre that is appealing to a very large number of people, then you have to think of somebody like Neil Simon in America, or somebody like Osborne in England, not the others. But the predominant idea is that, let me just talk about Osborne for a few minutes and then I will come to the theatre of the absurd thing. That would kind of end my contextualization. And this is significant because Osborne is, Look Back in Anger is 1956, whereas Waiting for Godot is being performed in England for the first time in 1955, I think. So Osborne is a bit late, but still let me talk about Osborne. And Look Back in Anger, as most of us, we know, we have been celebrating Look Back in Anger, or we have been unhappy with Look Back in Anger, either way. But it has remained a significant part of the curriculum. It has remained a significant part of the history of English theatre. Whether you hate it or love it, whether you like Osborne, you should not like Osborne. But anyway, and what the thing is, Look Back in Anger, although I firmly believe that it is not really a play of protest, it is a play of appeal. It is basically the average Englishman asking the establishment to give him something, asking the establishment to just listen to his pleas. He is shouting, he is pretending to rebel, but the Jimmy Porter paradigm is something that the establishment likes. And this is something that I keep repeating in almost all lectures about theatre, that what Jimmy Porter is asking for is that the establishment, the structure, look at him and give him what he wants. He is not trying to change, he is not trying to demand as such. He is not saying that there should be a dominant change, political change or anything. So, but the fact that this play is working, the fact that this play is popular, has one significant value. That is, it kind of shows that the audience is now ready for a little more. The audience is ready to accept a bit of the other. The audience is ready to get out of its comfort zone, the zone in which it is looking at tradition, it is looking at a confirmed structure which is non-problematic in all ways, but the acceptance becomes valuable. It shows that in the 1950s we have an English audience which is ready to experiment, perhaps. And of course the kitchen sink thing is also relevant, because what it does, and this is something Arnold Wesker had said, that in time of Shakespeare it was the world that was the stage, but in the middle of the 20th century it's the kitchen that becomes the stage. It's the limited inward movement. It's a much more democratic time. It's a much more individualistic time. So it's time to see the inside, it's time to see within and understand love, friendship, etc. I am not quoting him, but this is something that they are ready. And if you later on think about Harold Pinter or Tom Stoppard, you will see this is the paradigm that is functioning in their plays as well, because they are also looking at the room paradigm. I keep using the word paradigm. The room idea, they are also looking within a domestic sphere, and they are trying to work out the power equations, or the lack of power, or the lack of individual freedom, all such things within the periphery of the room, and within not the kitchen perhaps, but the room. And so this is how I come to the absurd, but I will shift from the room and I will just talk about Beckett for a while, because Beckett, as I said, we have the kitchen option, the realistic realism kitchen option, and we have the musicals, we have the popular farces, we have Shakespeare being reinvented, authentic revivals of Shakespeare, and along with that we have this new kind of theatre which is Waiting for Godot. And curiously enough, I'm quite sure you all know these details, that Waiting for Godot was first performed in 1955. It was in the Arts Theatre. It was a very small theatre. It was not one of the larger theatres, larger playhouses of the time, because people were not particularly enthusiastic about Waiting for Godot as such. I'll give you a few examples which will let you know why and how. Peter Hall was the director. It did find iconic success later on, but when it was imported for the first time from France, because as you know, Waiting for Godot came as a translation rather than an original English play. So this idea of a new kind of theatre coming to England was not accepted by the mainstream at all at the beginning. In fact, one of the most famous actors of that time, in fact he has been seen in a lot of films as well. He even played Sherlock Holmes in one film, if I remember particularly, in one of the Hound of Baskervilles versions. Ralph Richardson refused to be a part of Waiting for Godot. In fact, later on, somebody like Sir John Gielgud, I mean, if you think of such a towering presence, Sir John refused to be a part of Endgame later on when Endgame was being played. So a lot of mainstream people, a lot of significant people who were dominating the theatre scene were anti-absurd at that point of time. They did not understand and they did not really want to understand. And it's because what they were associating these new play, because they were going back to the tradition. They were looking at this idea of nonsense, the verbal nonsense that has been there as a sub-genre of performance. We do not have magazine programs anymore. I mean, in some functions there are magazine programs, but in television we used to have a lot of magazine programs. Verbal nonsense would be one element among many, and the ideas of allegory, the ideas of myth, fantasy, all these ideas, they were thought to be minor parts. They were thought to be parts of theatre, but when these things become more relevant, when these things come to the forefront and they replace the traditional conventional ideas of dialogue, of plot, then all these people, they are finding it almost unacceptable. And this is of course the English resistance to the other. And of course the avant-garde made sense to them, but they are not being able to, they are finding elements of the avant-garde here, they are finding elements of dream allegories here, but they cannot really make sense of what is happening because the structure that everybody is used to is completely missing. And if you look at the characteristics of a typical, there is no typical theatre of the absurd as such, but the absurd plays that we have been studying, that some of us may have even seen. YouTube has a lot of them, so you can. It's not impossible to see these plays. And the thing is, first thing that would strike you is that they are anti-rational, not anti-national, anti-rational. So they are anti-rational because rationality is a structured convention. Rationality, the idea of logic, has its roots in a very conventional philosophical mooring of any culture. Rationalities are not fixed as such. But if you think about it, then logic can be doubted, logic can be considered superficial, and logic has this idea of sense, that everything has to make sense. And not everything can always make sense. And that is one of the beginnings of the theatre of the absurd. If we draw the line from existentialism, if we draw the line from the Second World War, if we go back to Kafka, if we go back to, if we look at Camus, then you see this idea of making sense is something that logic depends on, but not everything always makes sense. Sense changes. But theatre of the absurd is not nonsense, because nonsense again is an established generic presence. Nonsense is something that depends on sense. Nonsense is something that would violate sense, and in order to have nonsense, you have to have a structured presence of sense. So the theatre of the absurd is not nonsense. It may use elements of nonsense. It may use certain things that you may find in Edward Lear or such, Lewis Carroll or some people like that, but those elements would be used, but not these plays would not become nonsense, because one of the major things that people kind of confuse, that the theatre of the absurd does not end up saying that life is absurd. What the theatre of the absurd says is that the way we try to make sense of life is absurd. Right? Just think about this. That the way we rationalize life, the way we justify life, the way we attach certain values to life, that is absurd. You need not have it. This is an anti-structure, anti-meaning kind of a form that our obsession with meaning, our obsession with a deeper meaning, which has been used by religion, which has been used by all kinds of political structures, that is something that the idea of the absurd speaks against. And of course, when we are talking about that, if we are anti-structured, then the idea of plot would be different. There would be possibilities, there might be elements of the surreal that would be there, and so on and so forth. And of course, the form must reflect the content. There would be formal absurdity as well as content in that. And see, one of the major problems these people like Sir John Gielgud or Ralph Richardson or a lot of contemporary theatricians had was that they could not understand the basic conflict that was there. Because we know that whenever we talk about theatre, the first thing that we look for is the central conflict. And in order to have conflict, you have to have at least two opposing values. And the absurd is discarding, the absurd is rejecting this value system altogether. That the traditional value system that we judge life with, that we kind of look at life with, is something that they are not trying to support or they are actually against. So conflict in a proper theatre of the absurd is quite a problem, isn't it? And the other thing that these people do is that whenever they are constructing characters, they make sure that these are not Shavian kind of carriers of ideas, not figureheads or anything. What they insist upon, that these are characters who do not understand that they are inhabiting an absurd space. These characters are normal characters, but life is not normal. Just like we don't really know how to make sense of the time right now, these characters are also, they are not aware of the meaninglessness, quote unquote meaninglessness of their existence. They and because they think of life as meaningful, life as full of value, it becomes very difficult for them to understand their situation. They cannot make sense of their roles, their function in life, how they should contribute, and how they should negotiate with convention, and etc. And so what the theatre of the absurd, these people do is that they use a lot of cliches. They use a lot of usual tools like language, for instance. Language is something that existential philosophy deals with in a different manner, because they think that language has become a failure as far as communication is concerned, because what we do is we look at language from a completely conventional point of view. We look at language from a cliched point of view perhaps, and we end up misinterpreting rather than understanding. So this is the dominant idea, although Pinter would say something very different later on. But this is the essential dominant area, but they are not really trying to ridicule language. Just like they are not trying to ridicule or devalue life, what they are trying to do is that how we ridicule the use of language. Right? How we are inadequate in our use of language. Language is a tool. Language cannot be adequate or inadequate. It's a tool created by humanity. So how you use that tool is the point that you need to focus on. And so on and so forth. And we have so many ideas like the narrative continuity that we expect. For instance, if you think about Waiting for Godot, Vladimir and Estragon disappear at night, they go to some other places, and we do not even try to draw the line whatever happened, where did they go, why are they existing separately when we do not see them, etc. We do not ask, we do ask these questions. We do not get the answers because that kind of narrative continuity is not possible in the absurd frame. And of course, so when we have all these elements, and if you posit it against a play like Look Back in Anger, again 1 year gap, but still from our point of view, if we look back at that particular time, and if you bring them together, you see how one is completely conventional, how one makes complete, even melodramatic sense in a way. Allison would come back, they would have a happy reunion, etc. And Waiting for Godot almost becomes something completely incomprehensible, something that is from another dimension. In the continent, it was a different idea altogether. In France, in the other European countries, they had this tradition of experimentation, and it worked better over there. But in England, this was almost alien, almost from another planet, if one may say so. And let me just talk about a few elements which we find in case in point is Waiting for Godot, and not the usual stuff, but see, what we have is there are several responses. In many ways, theatre of the absurd, like all other theatre, in fact all other literature, is a response to life, to society. And the loss of faith, the loss of religion, the loss of morality, if the good guys drop atom bombs on innocent people, then the definition of good, the traditional definition of good, is no longer functioning. So this challenge to morality, this idea of the value of life, a dominant religious worldview is suffering. So this is a response, and people are lost. And that state of being lost is represented in these theatres. And of course, the myth and ritual, not only the religious myth, but the myth of civilization perhaps. And our lives are dominated by rituals, some form or the other. Civilization is essentially a bunch of rituals which we accept as normative. And these myths and these rituals, they are thought about, they are challenged. And of course, this whole idea, this is again, this is something that has been there in human history forever. Our quest for this weird thing called truth. So what is truth? Who decides what is truth? And this entire philosophical idea of truths, there are so many truths, so many grand narratives, so many narratives, that it's quite enough to confuse any normal thinking individual. Jimmy Porter, I am sorry for saying this, may not be as much of a thinking individual as you might want him to be. But for a thinking individual, this idea of realizing truth, this idea of approaching truth, this is something that is not happening in the post-World War scenario. We are now a long time, we have a long gap between the war and everything. So we have forgotten, but they did not. The destruction, the damage that they saw. And selective representation was something that had begun at that point of time. I mean, selective representation has always been there in the world, as it's as old as politics itself. So, but the surreal, the irrational, along with no conflict, and this is something that people are not, and language is not a support anymore. So you can imagine that even within the postmodern framework, this is a very postmodern kind of an idea. The idea that a lot of critics would, a lot of commentators call it anti-narrative. And this kind of an idea is very much there. But again, like everything else, this is not becoming a very, very popular thing. Because this critique, this skepticism towards what we know as mimesis, imitation, realistic imitation, this is something that is not helping, because people are, for thousands of years, people have been kind of conditioned by this idea of conflict and realism. And the doubt of truth is not a popular doubt, because people want to believe what you tell them, as they are believing even now. But anyway, so the absurdists are trying to show all this, and they are trying to show all this not in the Shavian method by categorically mentioning all this, but creating a space on stage which is as absurd, which will make the audience ask the question, what is happening? And I will come back to this point. I am more than halfway through. Now, we must talk about Martin Esslin. I mean, we are talking about the theatre of the absurd, and we can't really talk about the theatre of the absurd without mentioning Martin Esslin, because he's the one who is creating, he's borrowing this term from, as we know, Camus myth of Sisyphus, the idea of absurdity, and he is bracketing, he's bringing together these few playwrights, and he is calling them those people who are writing in, it's not a school. This is something Esslin quite clearly mentions, that the theatre of the absurd does not mean that there is a group of people who are very consciously writing theatres which are alike. Just like the metaphysical poets that we have talked about, we read about. This is not a group. These are not a self-conscious or self-proclaimed kind of school of people. They are, in fact, if anything, each of them think that they are alone. Each of them think that they cannot, they have to tell their story, make other people understand that there is nothing to understand. They feel like outsiders, they feel lonely, they feel their own angst, and they cannot share it with anyone. There is no link. That old existential idea of every man as an island, that is very much there. And of course, speaking of existentialism, as you know, that there is this entire tradition of existentialist theatre. Sartre is writing, a lot of other people are writing within this form. So what is the difference between existentialist theatre and the theatre of the absurd? The theatre of the absurd is not existentialist theatre in the literary sense of the term. There are existential elements in the theatre of the absurd. But the difference is, and you see, Sartre was not fond of the theatre of the absurd. He in fact had written, not against, but he had critiqued this a lot, primarily because he was looking at a play like Ionesco's Rhinoceros. He was saying that why this refusal that the theatre of the absurd practices, that there would be no psychological mooring. You will not understand these characters in the way you usually understand people. There is no plot, there is no realism, all that. And this whole idea, and this is where the title of my presentation, the title is Theatre and the Absurd, Examining Existence. And being true to the theatre of the absurd, I am mentioning the title in the middle. So this idea of examining existence, this is where I got my title from, because existentialist theatre is examining existence in all sense of the term, because when you talk about examination, you kind of think of a result, you kind of think of an inference if it's an experiment. But what theatre of the absurd does is that it does not give you a solution. It only posits the problem. It only presents the problem. The solution remains for the audience to find, for the audience to celebrate. So the theatre of the absurd wanted to be a part of this idea of celebration overall, to inspire celebration among other people. So this is where the theatre of the absurd becomes a kind of freeing presence, that it will not give you a meaning, it will not impose a meaning, but it will offer you freedom to think. It will not give you a sense. What it will give you is an absence of sense. And the sense, if you can make sense of it, then fine. If you cannot, then you are also fine, because nothing really makes sense as far as these people are concerned. So, and the avant-garde theatre, this is something Martin Esslin is mentioning when we are talking about avant-garde theatre. Even the avant-garde theatre this is not only limited to that, because in the avant-garde theatre we have a lot of so-called positive and poetic presences. A theatre of the absurd will not allow poetry. Poetry speaks of a confirmed value system. So the theatre of the absurd is much less poetic, much more violent, because it challenges, it's even grotesque in many ways. It challenges a lot of ideas. And of course, the English audience, along with the other, it depends on the openness of the audience. The English audience had this problem with the theatre of the absurd, because what the theatre of the absurd does not allow is to your preconceptions cannot function. You cannot come with a preconceived notion, preconceived set of ideologies and make sense. You have to be open. You have to understand that your notions, your conceptions may not be valid. And this is something that people cannot agree to. This is something that people fail to do. If you have a conception, you think it's the right one. You cannot think of anything else. You cannot think of changing your ideas. This is the problem with our life, civilization, everything. So, and of course, what we automatically do is to look for communication through language. We want to make sense of whatever is being said. We cannot disregard or discard language. Whenever we hear something, we immediately try to impose meaning. We immediately try to read the entire signifier system, the sign into it. When Vladimir and Estragon say that let's go, we can't, why not, we are waiting for Godot. And this is repeated again and again and again and again in the play. And we kind of try to look at it as a motif, we kind of try to look at it as a signifier that will take us to another layer of meaning. But that's not what happens. Because this is more realistic in a way, because in life we rarely speak in such loaded, we do speak in loaded terms, but in general we might not speak in such loaded terms. So the puzzle that the theatre of the absurd creates is a problem for a lot of people. And this audience responds, whether the audience is unhappy, whether the audience cannot comprehend, or the audience is made to think, this is something that becomes very significant for the theatre of the absurd experience. Now I'll just talk about Harold Pinter and Tom Stoppard for a little while. maybe 10 or 12 minutes. Then I'll wrap up. So, as I told you towards the beginning, that Pinter, I do not think of Pinter as a part of this theatre of the absurd thing, although Martin Esslin is including Pinter in this group. But Pinter, the only thing that separates Pinter from the average theatre experience is his complete lack of exposition. He does not give us any explanation regarding his characters or the actions that are happening out of those characters. And I don't really want to quote him, but he had said that he did not want to sermonize. He did not want to give you a political kind of a statement. He is giving you a political statement, everything. I mean, you cannot avoid a political statement. The statements will always be political. So, he is not giving you a political or theological kind of wisdom. But what he is giving you is a set of events which you need to interpret on your own. These are completely within the realistic framework. If you see that language is realistic, the events are realistic, the setting is realistic, the people are realistic. What we do not have is the pre and the post. That is the only thing that separates Pinter. And of course, Pinter is not overtly responding to anything. In his later career, if you look at plays like Ashes to Ashes or One for the Road or Mountain Language, which is my favorite in fact, they are much more directly involved and political. You can almost understand what they are pointing towards. I mean, they are universal, but still there are topical references which can be understood in those plays. But early Pinter is talking about the power relationship that each and every individual share. And this is something which separates him, because in this power equation, he is showing that everything can be made sense when you think in terms of the macro and the micro power equations. And I'm not going to talk a lot about him because he is responding to, again, all the stimuli. But the thing is, he is not absurd because his plays make sense. He is not saying that language cannot communicate. He says that language can communicate only too well. He says that language is something that is used by humanity more to hide than to express. His plots are, you can see the flow, they make sense. It's again the lack of explanation that gives this aura of mystery to Pinter, and that is why Pinter belongs to the Pinteresque. And according to me, I mean, of course, there can be a lot of discussion regarding this. He is not a part of the absurd. But Tom Stoppard, when we talk about England, we have to talk about Tom Stoppard. Stoppard is the playwright who is dealing with this idea of the absurd, and in fact, he is taking this idea of the absurd to the so-called next level. Because I will talk about that, but see, Stoppard believes in toying with the audience, playing with the audience. If you have seen Shakespeare in Love, then you know what kind of an author Stoppard is, how he toys with these conventional ideas and everything. He wrote the screenplay along with someone else. And of course, Stoppard said that his inspiration was Osborne. And I will just quote him because I find this incredibly amusing. He said, "I started writing plays not very long after being moved to tears and laughter by Look Back in Anger." I mean, if you know Stoppard, you can put this in context and you can understand the nuances that are there in this particular quotation. But Stoppard his plays are not at all like Osborne's. They're not straightforward, they're not at all kitchen sink, but they are much closer to Beckett. they are firmly within this absurdist frame. And what and see, when we talk about Stoppard, the other thing that he is resisting, when we talk about Beckett or the theatre of the absurd, we talk about existential philosophy. And when we talk about existential philosophy, we are talking about a system of values. So Beckett's plays have that kind of mooring possible. You can approach them through the idea of the existential philosophy. But Stoppard is refusing that altogether. He is not allowing any kind of philosophical anchorage, any kind of foundation at all. And in fact, let me again quote him a little. I'm sorry, I don't really like quoting a lot, but these are quite amusing. And in an interview he had said, "I must say I didn't know what the word existential meant until it was applied to Rosencrantz. And even now, existentialism is not a philosophy I find either attractive or plausible. But it's certainly true that the play can be interpreted in existential terms as well as in other terms." So this kind of negation, this kind of almost cancellation is something that actually makes you understand what Stoppard is doing. He is completely removing all value systems, and he is locating his entire theatre in that arena where there is no such affirmation possible. I mean, what is he doing in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead? He is looking at one of the most philosophical plays in the history of English theatre. He is looking at Hamlet, and he is just picking out two completely insignificant characters and keeping them insignificant. In fact, what I believe is that in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, we have a play in which the protagonists are not the protagonists. They do not behave like the protagonists. They do not become the protagonists because they do not have any sway, any role in the movement of the play or in the movement of their own lives. From the very title we know that they will die. Even in this play they will die, and there is no way that they can go beyond that. And see, Vladimir and Estragon had hope. Waiting is hope. It might be indefinite. We might even know that Godot might never come, but still they are waiting because there is a hope called Godot. But Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are denied even that hope. So we now come to the true existential vacuum where no hope, no value system, no morality, no comprehension can function. And this is why I keep on saying that Stoppard is taking us to the next level, because what Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are looking at, are being ruled by, is pure chance, coincidence, not fate or not any kind of control, but complete and pure chance. So what he is taking from the theatre of the absurd is this idea of how man is existing in this postmodern age where life has become very, very different, and it's very difficult to make sense because truth is completely absent now. We do not know what truth is. Any kind of value system, any kind of morality, religion has become a tool, goes without saying. Any kind of any kind of value that might give some quote-unquote meaning is completely gone. The myth and rituals that we used to function, we are challenging that. we are still being ruled by certain myths which are outdated perhaps. The new myths are there and we don't really understand our myths anymore. And this disconnect that we have, and this disconnect with any kind of rationality that we have, as we see again in life. I mean, this is why, as I began, I said I agreed readily, because all kinds of rationality, there is a general failure that we are moving through. Life is quite absurd in this particular time, and etc. So this complete faith in signification is something that makes Stoppard a kind of ultimate playwright of the absurd. Even the next step, of course, it's because of the presence of Beckett that he can go to the next step. It's always easy to build upon a paradigm when you have that paradigm already, but creating, so Beckett remains the paradigm in this particular thing. Let me just say a few more words and then I'll end. This tradition of the theatre of the absurd, if you think about it, it did not really take root as such. It lasted for a few years. There were experiments. It remained an option, as I said. It did not become a global phenomenon. There were people like N.F. Simpson and some other playwrights who were trying to write in this particular form. Even in West Bengal, there has been some experiments, but the absurd did not continue. There were stray experiments, but a lot of other experiments, but the absurd did not last beyond a time. So probably it was limited. It was confined to a particular geotemporal location in our history, and it could not have survived. But it has its influence. It itself may not have continued, but it has this indelible influence which has kind of created a new path, a new possibility in the tradition of world theatre. That's what I end. Thank you so much. Right, and Devopriyo, I absolutely agree with you, because when we are together, when we are trying to make sense, we often use our powers of ridicule. When we see something that we do not understand, our response is ridicule. Our response is to find out, to laugh at that thing. That's a kind of comfort that it gives us when we can't really make sense of something. And when we are in the collective, we have this collective confidence, I guess, which gives us this sense of superiority with which we can look down upon an experience which we cannot understand. But when we are alone, if you look at the play alone, it will truly make you think. It will disturb you. That's the word, that it's supposed to disturb you. It's supposed to make you uncomfortable, and that discomfort translates into comedy, as in life that we do that. But when we critically try to make sense of it, we try to impose philosophical, that's how we critically interpret anything. We try to impose our philosophical training and all that. And that is where the theatre of the absurd also resists. It does not really give you the possibility of a confirmed philosophical consolation, so to say. So, as always, Devopriyo, I agree with you. See, whenever we talk about this entire existential idea, religion is one of the major problems, because our identities, whether we like it or not, are somehow or the other linked to some religion or the other. And starting from our names, we are kind of, a religion is imposed on the individual, whether that individual, there is no choice in fact. As far as religion is concerned, you have a choice of changing your religion, but you are born into a religion. And this kind of has been the dominating factor for a very long time, and the whole Eurocentric historical progression has been depending on religious constructs. Because if you think about Europe's history, the whole history of colonialism has been a history of they have pretended to spread civilization meaning Christianity. So that is how religion has been used forever, and even now I guess that has not stopped. But the thing is, post the Second World War, they were looking for God. I mean, they were not looking for religion, but they were looking for God. Where is God? The idea of the deity, the all-powerful supreme being who is looking after humanity, with a couple of atom bombs, with the Holocaust, with widespread murder in Africa, genocides in several parts of the world. This idea of the Godhead became rather problematic. And this is one of the major parts in any theatre of the absurd, because that comfort of divinity is completely absent. So denouncing religion is easy. Denouncing a structured religion is something that you can do easily, but denouncing the idea of God, divorcing the idea of God from your head is not as easy, because that conditioning is very, very deep rooted. So whenever we are talking about even the theatre of the absurds, the denunciation rather, of any such divine presence is something that you can feel. It's a palpable presence in these plays, that there would be not religion but the idea of God. Religion becomes the easy part. Religion becomes the expression which you can easily say that yes, I do not believe in Christianity, I do not believe in such religions, etc., so on and so forth. You can very easily say that. Not about all religions though, but not these days anymore. But you can do that, but this idea of the Godhead remains, and that tension is there in each and every play, and that is where I would agree with you entirely, that tension is there, and so the relationship is much more problematic than a simple denunciation. Thank you for that question. That is very interesting. Yes, of course, Look Back is completely pretending to be naturalistic, at least, because I am not a great fan of Osborne, as people know already. The thing is, the point that you are making is an exquisite point, because this idea of language, Timmy is speaking in proper understandable English. He is saying things that makes sense. He is speaking for pages and pages, apparently shouting, and this is something that I always discuss in class, that how can someone that angry speak that coherently? So I mean, in the first sign of anger, what we lose is our rational capacities. So we cannot really speak in that kind of a rational sequence. But this thing that you say, that what Osborne does is that this is not nonsense, rather this is a lot of noise which is supposed to mislead you. This is an excellent use of language. This is the point that Pinter made later, that we utilize language rather well, rather than being absurd or nonsensical. This is language used in such a way as to convince you that it has some meaning, as to please you, as being protest, while it's not really protest. Because it's spoken in vacuum, not to anybody else, but to an audience and to an establishment of critics who are celebrating it. By celebrating it, who are giving it agency. And that's the value of Look Back in Anger as far as we are concerned, because it's a play that uses language, that uses dialogues to make a whole generation of audience very happy and contented, so that they do not, it's the safety valve thing. Their anger is released, purged, instead of the pity and fear catharsis, where here we have the anger and frustration catharsis. So that language is designed to affect this particular kind of a thing. But thank you so much for this question. Absolutely, most definitely, because the tropes that the theatre of the absurd is not quite self-consciously using, because when we talk about postmodernism, we are talking about a lot of self-consciousness, because the challenges, the questions that are being asked within the format of postmodernism are quite conscious. But the theatre of the absurd may not be as conscious, but it definitely looks at, as I said, that it creates this idea of anti-structure. It not creates, but it involves this idea of anti-structure, and by questioning the entire value system, it is in fact leading us to the arena of what one might call high postmodernism. Like high modernism, one might call it high postmodernism. So we are definitely within the postmodern space as far as the theatre of the absurd is concerned.